And if you've ever wondered what true isolation, true terror, and true survival look like, then imagine this: a lone WW2 pilot floating in the vast, endless ocean, strapped to a half-deflated life raft no bigger than a child's mattress, the sun burning his skin raw, salt stinging every open wound, lips splitting, vision blurring, and beneath him circling, waiting. Rising from the deep like silent ghosts were sharks, dozens of them, their fins slicing the water like knives, their silhouettes drifting just beneath the surface. Always watching, always waiting for the moment his strength failed, and as he lay there, half-conscious, dehydrated, drifting in and out of hallucination, he realized the most horrifying truth of all: the ocean was not trying to kill him quickly. It was trying to kill him slowly. This is the story of a pilot whose plane went down in enemy waters, whose emergency gear malfunctioned, whose radio died before he could call for help, and whose fate should have been sealed in the first hour. But he didn't die. Not on day 1, not on day 2, not on day 3, and unbelievably, not even on day 6. Because what he endured, what he witnessed, what he fought through is so unimaginable that even the military interviewers, who later documented his survival, refused to believe parts of it, claiming that no human could withstand such psychological and physical torment, yet he did. The story begins in the violent chaos of the Pacific Theater, where naval aviators often said there were 3 ways to die: by the enemy, by the sea, or by the creatures living in the sea. And our pilot was about to experience all 3 at once, starting with a sudden mechanical failure at 4,000 feet that ripped his aircraft into a spinning descent toward the waves below, giving him only seconds to react, seconds to decide whether he would eject into unknown waters or ride the aircraft down and hope. The crash wouldn't kill him instantly, and as alarms screamed and smoke filled the cockpit, he yanked the canopy lever, felt the rush of wind slam into him, and launched himself into the burning sky, parachute barely opening before he slammed into the ocean with such force that he blacked out, sinking, swallowed whole by the darkness, his body pulled downward by the weight of his soaked flight suit. And when he regained consciousness, his lungs burning, he clawed his way upward toward a faint shimmer of light, breaking the surface with a gasp so desperate his throat tornly to find that his plane was gone. The sky was empty, and he was utterly alone. His parachute dragged him downward like an anchor, forcing him to cut himself free before he drowned. And as he did, he saw the first shark, gliding beneath him with silent, predatory grace, its body easily 8 feet long, its tail swaying in slow, powerful arcs, its eyes black and unblinking. His training told him not to thrash, not to bleed, not to make sudden movement, but panic does not listen to training. And his heart pounded so hard, he felt it vibrate through his whole body. But he forced himself to stay still, scanning desperately for his life raft, which had miraculously inflated a few meters away, and he swam for it with slow, agonizing strokes as the shark circled behind him like it was reading his every thought. He reached the raft, hauled himself onto it, and collapsed, chest heaving, throat burning, eyes stinging with seawater, and that was when the second shark appeared. Then the third, their fins carving deliberate paths around him, a living perimeter of death, as if they sensed weakness, sensed blood, sensed fear, and wanted to savor the moment before closing in. And as the sun dipped behind the horizon, the ocean shifted from blinding blue to ink-black darkness, and the sharks disappeared from sight, even though he knew they were still there. And there is a special kind of terror in knowing death is inches away, but invisible, silent, waiting. On his first night alone, the waves rocked the raft so violently he thought it would flip, and each time a swell lifted him. He imagined a shark lunging upward, jaws opening beneath him, dragging him into the deep where no one would ever find him. And he clung to the raft with white-knuckled desperation, whispering to himself, "Stay awake. Stay awake. Stay awake," because he knew that sleep meant rolling into the water, rolling into darkness, rolling into waiting jaws. He survived the first night by sheer adrenaline, but morning brought a new hell, the sun. There is no shade in the ocean, no shelter, nothing but exposure. And by midday of day 2, his skin was blistered, cracked, bleeding. His tongue so swollen he could barely speak. His eyes so dry he had to blink constantly to keep them from burning. He rationed what little water he had, but by the end of day 2, it was nearly gone. And he realized with dawning horror that dehydration would kill him long before the sharks did. And he began seeing shapes in the sky that weren't their planes, that never came closer. Rescue crews that never existed. Voices calling his name even though he knew he was hundreds of miles from friendly territory. But the worst moment of day 3 was not the dehydration, not the hallucinations, not the heat hit, was when one shark finally bumped the raft. Not a hard strike. A predator's question. Are you weak enough yet? He felt the rubber sag beneath him as the massive creature pressed its weight against the underside, and he scrambled to the far edge, trying to balance the raft without tipping it. And when the shark backed away, the others closed in, their fins cutting tight, deliberate arcs, each one closer than the last. His breathing grew shallow as he whispered to himself, "Not like this. Not like this." But the sharks weren't finished, and when dusk fell on day 3, the ocean became a circus of shadows and movement beneath him. And that night, he faced something far worse than the sharks themselves, the knowledge that the sharks were getting braver. And that was when he heard it, a splash behind him. Sharp, sudden, unmistakably large, and he turned slowly, praying it was a drifting log, a turtle, anything but another shark, but what surfaced was bigger, faster and hungrier than any he'd seen yet. Its massive dorsal fin rising like a blade, cutting the water so close he could have reached out and touched it. And he realized then, with a cold surge of terror, that the sharks understood something he didn't. He was weakening. And the ocean does not forgive the weak. Asterisk in the vast, merciless expanse of the Pacific Ocean, where endless blue stretches beyond the horizon, and the difference between life and death shrinks to the width of a single desperate breath. One pilot found himself plunged into a nightmare no training manual, no survival briefing, and no wartime story had ever prepared him for. And what happened over the next 6 days would become one of the most chilling, unbelievable, and pulse-pounding sagas of survival ever recorded. Beginning on a day that seemed routine, till the sky tore apart. The engine screamed and the ocean below opened like the jaws of a living beast, ready to swallow him whole. Imagine the cockpit trembling violently beneath your hands, alarms blaring, smoke filling the air, and the radio crackling with your squadron leader's voice desperately trying to reach you as your aircraft plunges toward the unforgiving waters below. Imagine knowing that in less than 60 seconds, your world will become cold, wet, and surrounded by predators. Because as the plane spiraled down, he wasn't just fighting gravity, he was fighting fate itself. As though some unseen force wanted to drag him into the darkest depths of the Pacific, where countless wartime airmen had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only wreckage, rumors, and the silent roll call of the missing. And when the crash finally came, slamming into the water with enough force to tear the wind from his lungs and rip metal apart like paper, he had no time to think, no time to prepare, only time to survive. Bursting to the surface to find himself alone, soaked, disoriented, and bobbing in the middle of nowhere as the sun scorched his skin and the waves tossed him around like a rag doll. And then just when he thought the danger had briefly passed, he saw it, a dark shape gliding beneath him. Slow, deliberate, unmistakably predatory. A massive shadow moving with a chilling calmness that only top-of-the-chain killers possess. And in that moment, he understood that surviving the crash was only the beginning of the nightmare, because now he was in their territory. The territory of sharks, the silent monarchs of the deep, their fins slicing through the water with deadly patience as they began circling him, studying him, testing him, waiting for the right moment. And as he clung to the partially inflated life raft, its rubber sides slick with seawater and his flight suit heavy with salt and despair, he realized that every instinct he had ever been taught in the cockpit, every ounce of training drilled into him since he first became a pilot, was about to be tested in ways no human had survived before. Because the sharks weren't just passive observers, they were moving in patterns, circling in perfect arcs, their dorsal fins cutting the surface like scythes, disappearing and reappearing in the churned waves, each approach closer, sharper, more calculated. A choreography of predation that left him frozen with terror, yet driven by the single unrelenting thought, survive or die. And he forced his mind to shut out panic, to force his arms to paddle carefully, keeping the raft balanced, keeping his blood contained, because he knew that thrashing would trigger the shark's curiosity, their hunger, their hunting instincts, and as the first night descended like a curtain, bringing blackness that seemed to pull at him from all sides, he could hear the subtle sounds of the ocean that he had never noticed before, the gentle lapping of waves against the raft, the faint hiss of water displaced by something moving underneath, and the occasional splash as a tail flicked just beyond the rim of vision. And sleep was impossible because even a moment of unconsciousness could be fatal. The raft could overturn. He could roll into the open jaws waiting for him. And with every hour that passed, the sun dipped further, leaving him with a darkness that pressed against his mind and body in equal measure, forcing hallucinations to creep in, voices whispering, shadows moving, the water taking forms that weren't there, imagining planes and ships and people that had vanished decades ago, trying to tell him he wasn't alone, or perhaps warning him that he truly was, utterly, hopelessly alone. And then hunger struck, gnawing at his stomach, sapping the last reserves of energy, his throat raw from dehydration, his skin blistering and peeling from sun exposure, each movement agonizing, yet still he paddled. Still he clung to the fragile raft, still he forced his hands to grip the sides with white-knuckled determination. And when the shark's silhouettes came closer, their eyes dark, cold, unfeeling, he had to make a choice every second: stay still and risk the currents capsizing him, or move and risk drawing their attention. And with a mind teetering on exhaustion and despair, he chose patience, every muscle tensed, every breath controlled as he floated on the endless expanse, a tiny human against an entire, indifferent ocean and the predators it harbored. And each night that followed intensified the horror, because by day 2 the lack of water made him dizzy, hallucinations more vivid, body trembling uncontrollably. And yet the sharks never left, always present, a reminder of mortality that could not be escaped. Circling in silence, gliding, always watching, as if aware of the fragile pulse above the water and waiting for it to falter. And by day 3, he realized that survival wasn't just about physical endurance, it was about mental endurance. A test of willpower against every element of nature, against predators, against his own fear. And every time the sun rose, the glare off the waves assaulted him, forcing him to shield his eyes, to count the fins cutting the surface, to calculate each movement with obsessive precision, to ration energy and strength for hours when exhaustion screamed. And when the first shark finally bumped the raft that morning, testing him a brief, terrifying touch against rubber that sent him sliding toward the edge, he knew that the 6-day ordeal would not merely be a battle of skill, but a battle of nerve, a confrontation with something primal and unrelenting, as if the ocean itself were sentient, as if it had singled him out for punishment, for trial, for a test that no man had ever passed without being marked by fear and the taste of salt. And through all of this, he never stopped thinking about his home, about the friends he had left behind, about the family who believed him lost, about the stories he would never tell if he didn't survive the next hour, the next minute, the next terrifying encounter with the circling shadows beneath, the raft that could snap the fragile balance of life in an instant. And as the hours bled into one another, indistinguishable except for the movement of the sun and the subtle shifts in the wind, he became hyper-aware of every sound, every ripple, every change in the rhythm of the ocean, as if each subtle vibration held a secret message about the intentions of the predators circling him. And on day 3, exhaustion had reached such a point that even controlling his breathing required a deliberate effort, a conscious command to muscles that refused to cooperate, and he began to feel an almost alien detachment, as though part of him had already surrendered to the inevitability of death, while the other part clung with an almost impossible intensity to the single, unyielding thought, "I will survive," because to surrender mentally meant to surrender physically. And the ocean would take him immediately, the sharks would seize him, and the delicate raft would flip without mercy, carrying him to the depths. Never to resurface, never to be remembered, never to become the story he knew he was meant to live through. And yet he could not sleep, could not close his eyes even for a second. Because the dark had a voice of its own, whispering from beneath the water, twisting his imagination, amplifying the shadows beneath the surface until each ripple could be a tale. Each shimmer could be a jaw, and every faint splash sounded like the final strike of death. And he kept his arms and legs as still as possible, tensing them only when necessary to balance the raft, forcing each movement to be slow, deliberate, measured, while the sun rose again and again, scorching his back and head, cracking skin, drying lips, burning eyes, and the salt water clinging to him like fire. Burning sores that throbbed with every heartbeat, yet he endured, counting breaths, counting the fins, cutting through the waves, counting every shadow that moved beneath him, memorizing every shift in water temperature, every swirl of current, every faint vibration that might signal the approach of something larger. And on the fourth day, with his energy near zero, he realized he had become acutely aware of the psychological warfare being waged by the sharks themselves, as if they were testing his patience, his will, his ability to remain still and sane for the smallest chance of survival, circling, retreating, returning, probing. And then the sky began to darken, low clouds gathering in strange, ominous patterns that reflected on the ocean's surface, turning the water from an indifferent blue into a churning, shifting gray, almost as if the elements themselves were conspiring against him. And the waves began to rise, the wind picking up, and he realized that any sudden gust could tip the raft and send him into the jaws of death below. And yet he forced himself to remain calm, gripping the raft with hands swollen and blistered, feet pressed against the base to stabilize, heart hammering, lungs gasping for the tiniest breaths of oxygen. And as night fell again, he saw a movement in the water unlike any he had observed before. A slow, methodical approach from several sharks at once, coordinating, spacing themselves in arcs, keeping him surrounded, testing him, herding him like a cornered animal. And he had to carefully adjust his position to remain balanced, to avoid a fatal misstep, to avoid any sign of weakness that would trigger an attack. And even as the stars blinked coldly overhead, he could not rest. He could not close his eyes. He could not stop thinking about the razor-sharp teeth beneath, the weight of the water, the endless hours of isolation, the slow burn of dehydration, the blistering sun during the day, the cold and dark at night. Each sensation amplified into a relentless reminder that he was fragile, mortal, completely at the mercy of forces that had no mercy in their nature. And yet, astonishingly, he endured, driven by a combination of primal fear, stubborn willpower, and an almost supernatural determination to remain alive, calculating each movement, each breath, each subtle shift of his body to avoid disaster, forcing his mind to focus on tangible tasks, counting seconds, counting waves, counting fins, counting every heartbeat, because losing focus for even a fraction of a second could be fatal. And he endured hour after hour, day after day, until the fifth day, when fatigue reached levels he had never known possible, his body trembling uncontrollably, his vision blurred, his mouth dry and cracked beyond repair, his mind teetering on the edge of consciousness and delirium. And yet he remained alive, a testament to endurance, willpower, and the terrifying, intimate understanding of a predator's mind, a tiny human battling against the ocean and the apex predators within it, with nothing but a fragile raft and his own will standing between life and certain death. And as the fifth day pressed on, each minute felt like an eternity, a cruel distortion of time, where light and dark blurred into a single, unrelenting continuum. And he could no longer distinguish between the hours of day or night. Every sound of the waves amplified into monstrous echoes. Every shadow beneath the raft became a potential predator, and the water itself seemed to pulse and breathe around him, alive, watching, testing him, as though the ocean had a consciousness, aware of his fragility, his fatigue, his desperation. And he had to fight every impulse to give in, every natural desire to collapse, to let himself drift into unconsciousness. Because the sharks were always there, always calculating, and he had learned that any lapse in attention could mean a single fatal strike, yet he could not escape the pounding thirst, the burning hunger gnawing at his stomach, the raw, splitting pain of skin sunburned and blistered beyond comprehension, and his limbs swollen from days of exposure and lack of proper circulation, refused to obey his commands at times, moving sluggishly, unpredictably, as though his body itself were conspiring against his survival. And yet still he endured, clinging to the raft with every ounce of strength, forcing his mind to focus on the mechanics of survival, scanning the water for approaching predators, rationing the tiny sip of water he had left, adjusting his position to balance against the waves, thinking constantly about rescue and the faintest possibility that anyone might be searching for him, and when a sudden swell of the ocean tossed him violently to one side, narrowly avoiding the sharp dorsal fin of a circling shark, his body surged with adrenaline, every muscle tensing, every nerve screaming, his mind hyper-aware, scanning the water in every direction, calculating escape paths, measuring distances, counting rotations, estimating speeds, and realizing that at this stage, the sharks weren't just hunting him, they were teaching him, testing his awareness, his patience, his ability to endure the unimaginable, and the waves crashed relentlessly, as though the ocean itself had joined the hunt, pushing him, pulling him, threatening to capsize the raft. And he had to constantly adjust, constantly fight, because the smallest mistake, the smallest miscalculation, could mean the end, the abrupt, merciless consumption of his fragile human body by predators perfectly evolved for killing. Yet he endured hour after hour, day after day, refusing to yield, and on the fifth night, as darkness settled like a suffocating blanket, he experienced the deepest terror yet, because in the blackness, the water became opaque. Shadows merged into unseen shapes. The faint sound of moving fins became louder, closer, more deliberate, and he realized that the predators had become emboldened, their curiosity growing, their movements bolder, and the weight of impending doom pressed down on him with a physical force. His heart racing, lungs burning, muscles trembling uncontrollably, mind slipping toward delirium. And yet amidst all this, he had learned to remain calm, to control panic, to focus on the tasks he could control, to anticipate the sharks' movements, to respect their intelligence, their power, their absolute dominance. And somehow, against all odds, against every natural law, he endured, surviving another night. Another day, still alive, still clinging to life, still fighting the most grueling, terrifying, and primal test of endurance a human being could ever face, knowing full well that the sixth day would bring even greater horrors, yet refusing to surrender because surrender meant death, and he was not yet ready to die, not yet, not now, not while the ocean and its relentless predators continued to circle, waiting, watching, judging, calculating, as he clung to the fragile line between life and death, a tiny human adrift on an endless, merciless, and living sea. And as the sixth day approached, his body teetered on the edge of collapse, every joint stiff, every muscle screaming in protest, every nerve raw from constant tension, and yet he clung to the raft with the stubborn, almost instinctual refusal to yield, because to let go would mean instant death. And the sharks, now more confident, circled in tighter patterns, their fins slicing the water like knives, each movement deliberate, as if mocking his fragile human strength. And the sun rose again, harsh and blinding, reflecting off the ocean in violent waves that threatened to disorient him completely, his eyes burning from constant exposure, lips cracked and bleeding, tongue parched and swelling, hands blistered and raw, feet numb from cold and exposure. And still, he forced himself to paddle slowly, to adjust the raft, to ration every movement, to breathe carefully, to remain conscious for another hour, for another minute, knowing full well that the smallest lapse could be fatal, and the mind, strained beyond natural limits, began to blur the lines between reality and hallucination. Yet he remained, aware that every hallucination carried with it the potential to make him act carelessly, to make him shift the raft just enough for the sharks to strike, and he fought against it, forcing every thought to serve survival, forcing every nerve to remain alert, every tendon to respond, and the ocean seemed to respond in kind. Waves rising higher, currents stronger, the wind sharper, as if it were a sentient force, aware of the living and the weak, testing him continuously, relentlessly, and the sharks, too, seemed to feed on his awareness of them, circling faster, cutting arcs around the raft, disappearing below only to reappear, a constant, invisible threat beneath the water. And when he saw the dorsal fin break the surface mere inches from the raft, a jolt of terror surged through him, muscles stiffening in preparation for a sudden movement that might be misinterpreted as weakness. And he held perfectly still, chest heaving, eyes wide, waiting, counting, assessing, predicting, realizing, with a mixture of fear and awe, that he had developed an intimate understanding of these predators, their movements, their patience, their psychology. Yet he was aware that knowledge alone could not save him, that sheer luck, timing, and endurance were required. And when a wave slammed against the side of the raft, tipping it dangerously, he barely managed to grab the edges, forcing himself upright, soaked, exhausted, shaking, and the sun glinted off the water, blinding him, as if the ocean itself were taunting him, daring him to falter, and he continued, minute by minute, hour by hour, paddling, balancing, observing, surviving, as the hours stretched endlessly, a purgatory of salt, sun, hunger, fear, fatigue, and predators. And as night fell on the sixth day, his body pushed past comprehension, energy nearly zero, consciousness fragmented. Yet he remained awake, watching, surviving, listening to the subtle movements of the sharks, the whisper of the waves, the distant call of birds, the faintest hint of wind, each sound a potential threat, each movement an opportunity, and somehow, against every natural law, against every limit of human endurance, he continued to exist, to cling to life, to outlast the ocean, the predators, the sun, the darkness, the fear, the pain. As he floated in the endless, merciless expanse, a lone human defying death itself, still alive, still breathing, still clinging to the fragile thread between life and oblivion, because surrender was not an option, because death was not yet permitted. And because somewhere beyond the horizon, somewhere beyond the endless ocean, hope still existed, faint but undeniable, compelling him to endure, compelling him to survive, compelling him to face another day in a world that seemed intent on swallowing him whole. And in the final hours of that sixth day, as darkness fell once more over the endless ocean, he was reduced to a state where thought and reflex merged, where survival was not a conscious choice but a primal imperative, and every fiber of his being screamed in protest against the relentless sun, the unforgiving salt, the merciless hunger, and the constant threat of the circling predators. Yet he clung on, eyes wide, muscles tensed, mind razor sharp. Despite exhaustion so profound, it felt as though he were a ghost inhabiting his own body. And the sharks, those relentless sentinels of the deep, moved in an almost ritualistic pattern, testing him, hurting him, teaching him, reminding him of the fragile line he walked between life and death. And though delirium threatened to claim him, he forced himself to count every fin break, every ripple, every subtle movement of water, mapping the behavior of his hunters, anticipating their attacks, and using the smallest openings in the currents to stabilize the raft, to adjust his body, to ration his remaining energy. And as the night deepened, the wind shifted, bringing a chilling, salt-laden spray that stung his eyes and numbed his face, and he realized that the ocean had not yet released him, that the final test was upon him, but somehow, impossibly, he endured, heart hammering, lungs burning, muscles trembling, and then, in the black void of night, a distant shimmer appeared on the horizon, faint, almost unreal. A reflection of searchlights, of ships, of hope. And his body surged with adrenaline, every remaining ounce of strength focused on that tiny glimmer, knowing that reaching it could mean the difference between death and life, yet still aware that one false move could send him into the jaws of the circling predators. And with a combination of willpower, training, instinct, and sheer luck, he began paddling toward it, counting each stroke, timing each movement, forcing himself not to panic as the sharks followed, maintaining a perfect balance on the raft, moving inch by agonizing inch. And as the hours stretched, as the darkness pressed, as the predators remained silent but ever present, he began to hear the distant hum of engines, the faint glint of light growing larger, more defined. And the impossible realization struck him that he had survived 6 days adrift, surrounded by predators.